Good evening. Hello, hello. Good evening, all. Thank you for joining us for another Arboricultural Association webinar. My name's John Parker, Technical Director at the Association, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to Stonehouse in the UK. Please use the chat to say hello and let us know where you're watching from. But remember, select all panelists and attendees before you do so. Worst catchphrase ever, I'm sorry. Questions via the Q&A button, please. Don't put your questions in the chat because I won't be able to see them. I'm really looking forward to this evening, and lots of you were as well, I think, because we had a record-breaking number of registrations, so all very exciting. I'll be introducing our speakers in just a moment, but first of all, a quick plug for next week's webinar, which will be all about yew trees. Jeff Monk and Paul Greenwood will be joining us for Understanding the Yew. I can't quite believe that we resisted some of the amazing puns on offer for a yew tree seminar, but we went for a serious name. This is how we've matured in the face of these large audiences. Then, the following week, on March the 31st, is the Fungi Symposium. Now, you can buy tickets to the whole day for £25 for members or £50 for non-members, and the evening Wednesday webinar session is, of course, completely free of charge for everyone. There's loads more information on our website, and I encourage you to take a look. Hopefully, many of you will have bought, and some of you will have received, the new fungi books by David Humphreys, Christopher Wright, and Lynn Boddy. They're absolutely amazing. You can still get hold of them exclusively through our website, and our packing elves have been very busy working to dispatch them this week. If you haven't received yours yet, please be patient. They are on the way. And just to let you know, after the Fungi Symposium, we'll be taking 3 weeks off webinars before returning with more great stuff for you on April the 28th. But panic not, because during that time, you'll all be invited to join in with everyone's favorite sporting event, because yes, that's right, the Urban Tree World Cup is back, and it's now got qualifying rounds, which will start on April the 1st. Can London Plane retain the title it won at the Urban Tree World Cup 2020? Stay tuned to find out. There'll be more about that on our website, social media, and all that kind of thing. So, on to this evening. Some of you might have seen Ted Green's webinar debut last week, an event which seems to have already become part of our arboricultural mythology. One thing he said was that when we think of a tree, we're often only considering half of it, the bit that's above the ground. And it's often true that nowhere near enough thought goes into the other half, the subterranean world and the soils around it. So tonight, we're going to be putting that right with two great speakers who will be telling us all about soil and trees, a subject which many of you have been asking for. So it does work. If there's topics you want to see covered, please let us know. We'll soon be hearing from Emma Schaffert from the Bartlett Tree Research Laboratory in the USA. But first of all, I'm very pleased to introduce Claire Harbinson of Treework Environmental Practice. Claire, it's over to you.
So thanks first to John for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you all. And from people all over the world. That's fantastic. So as you introduced, I'm Claire Harbinson. I'm a principal arboricultural consultant with Treework Environmental Practice. And we are an arboricultural consultancy in the UK. And we've been at the forefront of the movement to value, preserve and understand ancient and veteran trees. And our director, Neville Fay, who's probably familiar to quite a number of you, is a founder of the Ancient Tree Forum and has spearheaded sort of research and policy around ancient and veteran trees over the last sort of 2 or 3 decades. And his work and exploration has meant that in our practice, we view the tree not just as the trunk and the branches and the leaves and the roots, but also all of the organisms and microorganisms that live on the tree, and also the soil that the tree grows in. So we see very much the tree as a habitat and an ecosystem. So trees obviously can't move. They grow in the same place for sometimes hundreds of years. And so therefore they both influence and are influenced by the soil that they grow in, and the relationship is profound. So at our practice, we believe that as arboriculturists, soil should really be at the centre of everything that we do. However, that's sometimes quite difficult to do in practice, and it's a steep learning curve. So in the Italian Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci wrote that we know more about the movement of the celestial bodies than we do about the soil underfoot. And in fact, 500 years later, we probably haven't advanced a great deal, and we're still struggling to understand the ground beneath our feet. One thing, however, that I think is probably apparent to most of us, and whilst obviously my experiences with the UK, and quite a lot of this presentation is related to the UK and perhaps Europe, I think it's a common phenomenon across the world that our soils are in crisis. And some of the images that you see on this slide here will probably be quite familiar to a number of you. It's been estimated that for the UK, we have fewer than 100 harvests left if we continue at the current level of intensive farming and pollution and urban development. At the same time, as arboriculturists in the UK, we're seeing increasing incidences of novel tree diseases and declines. Now, the convention is to attribute those to the rise of a single pathogen, even perhaps where that pathogen can't be identified. But in our practice, in carrying out work investigating, in particular, oaks with acute oak decline, we began to wonder whether actually these systemic and population scale declines and diseases actually have a more systemic explanation. And it wasn't long before we started to make the link between soil degradation, lack of soil fertility, and tree disease. And we started to wonder maybe whether some of the declines and the diseases that we were seeing in part were attributable to soil problems, either directly through a soil pathogen or indirectly. And by indirectly, I mean because when the soil is not functioning to support the tree, then the tree will have a lower resistance to disease and pathogenic attack, even if that pathogen is not in fact soil-borne. So we wondered whether actually trees are the canaries in the coal mine for soil degradation in the same way that they were, say, for acid rain in the 1980s. So how does a tree continue to grow and derive nutrients from the same patch of soil for hundreds of years without fertilizer? So if you keep house plants, you'll know that they need fertilizing periodically, or perhaps they need repotting into fresh soil. But obviously we can't do that with trees, and trees can't do that. Instead, they farm their own soil. So they shed their own parts into the soil for recycling, the twigs, the leaves, the branches, all of the associated organisms that live on those. And then below ground, the fine roots and the turnover of fine roots, the turnover of mycorrhizal fungal hyphae, and the sloughing off of cells from persistent roots. And these discarded plant parts are taken down into the soil by larger soil fauna if they're not there already, broken down, remineralized for reuptake by the tree in the soil water. And that breakdown is affected by a series of specialist soil organisms. And trees can actually manipulate those microbial communities themselves. So they can attract the microbes that they need to perform those functions via exudates of sugars, minerals and proteins and hormones through the roots. So soil farming in this way and soil manipulation gives the tree nutrition, it suppresses soil-borne pathogens, and then through the fungal networks that are associated with the tree roots, it also creates conduits for communication and for community resilience. It's what Lynn Boddy would call the wood wide web. You might have heard that phrase before. And the wood wide web functions very much like our own immune system, with the exception that it's not a closed system, it's a massive open system. And as a massive open system, that makes it very vulnerable to anthropogenic disturbance. So what might be some of the issues with soil then that might lead to declines and disease, or at least contribute to them? So some of them might be obvious to us. So poor hydrology, poor aeration, nitrification, which is a consequence of intensive farming for most countries these days, mycorrhizal decoupling, a lack of organic matter, and then of course the effects of pollution, both air pollution, water pollution, ground pollution on soil biology and chemistry. So those are some of the factors that might be linked to tree decline, but actually when we looked in the literature for evidence of these, we soon realised that most research on soil and plant interactions is based on ephemeral or annual plants like agricultural crops. And of course, that stands to reason because they're much easier to study, and that's where the money is. There are comparatively few studies outside of plantation forestry on soils and long-lived plants like trees. So that means that what we don't really have is any soil health benchmarks. I mean, arguably, there aren't really very good soil health benchmarks for soil generally, in fact, but we certainly don't have any soil health tree standards that we can refer to in our management of trees to assess, you know, is this, how good is this soil? I mean, there are some, and I'll go into that, but it's really, it's a very developing area that needs a lot more work. So there's a bit of a lack, as I've said. So we decided to start looking into the issue ourselves. And at the same time, we had a number of clients with high profile trees that were beset with sort of decline problems like acute oak decline and other sort of population-wide problems like Massaria. And so we set up a series of studies to try and tease out and investigate the relationships between soil health and tree health. So we went to work, we developed a very complicated Crown assessment system. We took soil samples and sent them off to the lab for tests. We used a penetrometer everywhere to try and measure the bulk density. We looked at the soil visually. We did all of these things. And initially, we realised that we'd collected a load of numbers, but we didn't really have anything to compare them to. There was no real baseline. And so this prompted the question, what is healthy soil for trees? Can we even answer that question, first of all? And by healthy, I mean, what do trees need from soil to thrive rather than just sort of survive and hang on there? You know, how can they occupy that same patch of soil for hundreds of years in a healthy and relatively disease-free way? So this was the start of our journey, really. And we used what literature there was and a bit of common sense and then our arboricultural knowledge to try and sort of feel our way. And one of the first things we needed to look at is to actually take a step back and rather than just looking at what is healthy soil, but actually what is soil. Soil is created by physical, chemical and biological processes. So the physical processes are obviously the weathering of the rock to create the mineral fractions, the sands, the silts, the clays. The chemical processes are the constant breakdown and reassembly of the molecules in the soil. And the biological processes are the decomposition and the recycling of plant parts, soil organic matter, by the various plants, animals and microorganisms that live and die in the soil. So broadly, a well-structured soil should have about these ratios. So 25% of it is actually holes, it's air. Perhaps we could get sometimes because trees make oxygen, actually the roots follow the opposite process, so they respire, so they require oxygen to live. 25% water, roughly 5% organic matter, and then 45% other, which is the actual mineral fraction, and then all of the soil biota in all of its diversity. And it is really diverse. So it's been estimated that around a quarter of the Earth's biodiversity is actually beneath our feet in the soil. And we can't even identify even a fraction of these species. You know, we're looking at it at the level of operational taxonomical units, I think, for the most part. Another interesting fact for you, it said, and I don't know who's counted this, but it said that a teaspoon of soil contains more organisms than there currently are humans living on the planet. So soil is a living organism effectively, but we often don't treat it in that way. So just to sum up then, so, you know, to effectively achieve good soil health in some way, these broad parameters have to be about right. So if we were to take a crumb of soil and look at it, it would probably look something like this. We've got our sand particles, our smaller silt particles, our even smaller clay particles bonded with organic matter. We've got our air spaces. We've got these films of water that surround all of the particles. And then we've got various things living in these different niches. You know, we've got varying sizes and varying trophic levels. We've got springtails, flagellates, nematodes. Obviously, we've got the fungi, we've got the bacteria, and obviously we've got the mycorrhizae that will be colonising the plant roots as well as the free living fungi. So that's some of what a healthy soil crumb would look like. It would have all of these things, and there'd be an immense amount of activity going on constantly. So, as I said, we struggle to define healthy soils, and one of the reasons for that is because soil is so incredibly variable, you know, across the landscape scale, but even within the same field or park. And soil type itself varies, the plant communities living in the soil vary, soil fauna communities vary. So it's quite difficult to generalise in some ways, but there are some functional characteristics that we know we want from a healthy soil for trees or anything that's growing in it, really. So one of those is obviously that it needs appropriate nutrients for plant growth. We want good infiltration so that the rain can penetrate. But soil needs also to be able to store a decent amount of water for the times where it's not going to rain for a long time. It needs to be aerobic, as I explained before. We need good oxygen levels in there, and to achieve that, then we need good gaseous exchange with the atmosphere. It needs to stay where it is, so it needs to be erosion resistant. And then it also needs to have this diverse soil biota in order to continue to function, and that ties in with disease resistance. So here's a couple of microscope slides from some samples of soil that we took. So on the left is an ancient woodland soil from the UK. So it's been relatively untouched for years. And you can see it looks very different from the one on the right. So this woodland soil, it's full of complex materials. We've got lots of different fragments of organic matter of different sizes and presumably in different stages of decomposition. So we're likely to have humic substances there, which is the fraction that's most recalcitrant in organic matter. You can see a little length of fungal hyphae in the middle. We've got bacteria dotted throughout. If we ran a video of this, you would probably see lots of protozoa swimming through there somewhere in the soil water solution. We've got lots of pores of different sizes, which creates these niche habitats for these different soil organisms, which I showed you on the slide earlier. So much of this is going to have been created, this environment is going to be created in a woodland soil by the trees themselves. As I explained earlier, this concept of trees farming their own soil. It's the type of soil that I suspect most trees have evolved with and that they've created. So, I mean, we do know, for example, that trees prefer much more fungal soils than bacterial soils. We know about the value of mycorrhizal fungi, obviously, in their relationship with plant roots, but obviously the free living fungi that live in and amongst the soil are also important. So on the right, we've got a turf grass soil. I think this is taken from a golf club somewhere. So it's probably not exactly inert, but it's certainly not going to be as biodiverse as the soil on the left. It's a very sandy soil, so it's going to be very, very free draining. We don't have a lot of different sizes of pores. They're probably just going to be the very large ones. We've got much less diversity of organic matter and just less activity generally. That's going to be more bacterially dominated too. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, that's what grass prefers effectively, but that may not be the right place to then try and grow trees that are really going to look fabulous and thrive for a long time. So if we think that soil might be part of the problem with some tree management issues that we're dealing with, or diseases that we're, or declines that we're observing, how might we go about assessing that? So I'm just going to take you through some of the things that we do in our practice. I think Emma's going to go into this in a lot more detail, so I'm really just going to sort of touch on a few points. The initial thing to do, obviously, is to just look at what's around you. So some problems with soils are easily observable. We've all observed ponding on the surface, signs of compaction, wheel ruts, very dry, cracked soil, very wet soil. Those sorts of things are pretty obvious. It's also good to have a look at the suite of plant communities that's growing there, perhaps more so in a more rural setting than, say, in an urban setting, where that's more likely to have been artificially manipulated. And there's lots of diagnostic plants. In fact, I've just picked out 3 of them here to illustrate what I'm saying. So on the left here, we've got Juncus effusus. I think it's a Juncus. I hope it's effusus. It's a soft rush. And that's very much associated with wet soils or soils that experience periodic waterlogging. In the middle here, we've got plantain, which is associated with disturbed soils and compacted soils. And on the right, we've got Urtica dioica, which is the common nettle in the UK. And that's associated again with disturbed soils, but also soils with a high level of nitrogen. So those can be indicators of certain things that are going on. Another thing to do is to look at the soil species for the area of interest. So in the UK, and I think in many other places, I think Europe, the States, I think you've got really good soil maps also. We have really good soil maps that we can refer to. I'm sorry if I'm a bit concentrating on certain countries. It's just my knowledge of elsewhere is not particularly good, I'm afraid. But we've got some really good soil maps that will show us the type of soil that we could expect in this area. They're less useful for urban areas because obviously there's been huge amounts of disturbance and layers upon layers of building rubble and all sorts of other things going on. But in more rural or peri-urban areas, they can still be pretty useful. So that's the first layer. The second sort of level we would go to is just to dig a hole. You can learn an awful lot about how well a soil is functioning, particularly in terms of things like air and water movement, simply by digging a hole and examining the soil, squeezing it, breaking it apart, manipulating it, looking at its colour, smelling it. A trowel or a spade should definitely be in every arborist toolkit, and preferably some soil augers, I think, too. We use a technique called visual soil assessment, which is relatively new to us to guide us. I'm not going to go into this now, but there are some really great resources on the web if you Google visual soil assessment about how to interpret some of the things you might find when you're doing these sorts of assessments. And of course, you can also do very basic tests yourself, like infiltration tests in the field that don't require necessarily an expert. And then the next layer after that, if you still want even finer grain information, is to take some soil samples and then get them analysed in a lab. And if you're going to do that, it's obviously important to tell the lab what it is that you want them to look for. So I would always recommend that you look at soil texture. So, is it clay loam, sandy soil? Because that will give you then an idea about some of the other parameters that you're looking at. You're not going to expect, for example, fantastic drainage in a heavy clay soil. You should get them to have a look at moisture content, measure the moisture content, some chemical analyses of the key macronutrients and some of the micronutrients. And then if you can, find a lab that can also look at the biology for you. So we're lucky enough at TreeWorks to be partnered with a lab called Soil Biolab, which does a biological analysis by plate counting and culture and detailed microscopy. Because the state of the biology can tell you something about how well the soil is functioning. And it's not a very fine-grained analysis, because that's probably not going to tell us anything. But we know, for example, that if we've got low biodiversity, or we've got low levels of active fungi or active bacteria, that perhaps the soil isn't functioning as well as it should. Maybe we've got poor hydrology or anaerobic conditions. We also try to take root samples and we have them analysed for mycorrhizal colonisation, and we can then try and link that back to our other results. So, assuming you've used one of the foregoing methods and you've identified some problems with your soil where your trees are growing, perhaps you've discovered that your soil is compacted, or maybe it's poorly aerated, or it's got poor infiltration or poor microbial activity. What can you do? Obviously, you want to be able to do something to remediate, to improve tree health. So there's a lot of products out there and a lot of techniques. Some of the techniques that are traditionally used in other parts of soil management particularly as regards structure, not really available for us if we're using them around existing trees. Things like subsoiling, you'd end up cutting through all of the roots. So we have to use other techniques to be able to improve those things. So at TreeWorks, we like to try and use methods that are as natural as possible, and that don't introduce too much sort of foreign matter, if you like, into the soil. If we're trying to boost nutrition and disease resistance, we like to use aerated compost tea, or ACT. That is made by combining water, high quality compost material, and biostimulants as a food source to multiply the organisms, the microorganisms that already live in the compost. And then that's applied to the tree to try and boost the microbial activity in the soil. It's aerated, so oxygen's pumped through while it's being brewed, and that serves to further boost the populations, more so than it would be if you just left it to brew. Studies have suggested that when aerated compost tea is applied to soil in liquid form, it helps to stimulate root growth. And there's further evidence that when it's applied as a mist foliar spray to the above ground parts, there are benefits of nutrient uptake through stomatal absorption, which then obviously aids photosynthesis, and can also, in some instances, it's believed, crowd out other pathogens on the leaves simply by outnumbering in certain circumstances. It's pretty much as old as the hills as a technique. People have been using it for centuries. And provided your compost source is one that's going to provide more or less the right microbes for the type of soil that you're dealing with, then I don't think you really need to worry too much about the exact species of microbes that are going in there. It's been historically used by gardeners and farmers, but more recently it's become more widely used in the grape growing and wine producing industries. So that proves that it has some sort of benefit for woody plants as well, albeit small ones. So, of course, trees are an order of magnitude larger than crops or grapevines. So we had to work out a way that we could apply it to trees. And we use two methods. We use a root drench, which is pretty straightforward. But we also have this foliar misting as well. So we've developed a system using water-fed poles and a hose and a flexible spray head to be able to deliver the compost tea up into the canopy. There's some pictures of that there. We normally apply in the growing season only. Obviously, there's not much point in applying when the roots aren't growing. So that's sort of round about now-ish through to the autumn time. If we're looking to improve nutrition but also structure, then compost tea isn't really going to do that. So then we tend to go back to the more traditional technique of mulch, which is absolutely not new to any of you. We use different types depending on the situation to be remediated. So on the left, for example, we've got a lot of fairly coarse chipped risings from tree surgery work. And then on the right here, we've got a mulch derived from composted leaf mould, and those would be broken down at very different speeds. So when we returned a year later, this leaf mould on the right here, that had pretty much been well incorporated into the soil, whereas the wood chip mulch on the left was still very much on the surface. But if you turned it over, there's a lot of really good high full growth, ramifying through there. So in time, it will get taken in and incorporated, and that will improve the structure and the aeration and the drainage and so on and so forth, and also the soil microbial biodiversity too. So it's important with all of these things to get the right type of mulch. It's not all created equal. So that's in terms of size and also provenance, so where it's come from. Just to give you an example, chip from conifers is usually pretty acidic, and it's usually pretty high in the sort of more resistant organic matter. So it can take a long time to break down, and if you apply it around broadleaves, there may not even be the native soil organisms to be able to break it down. Obviously, thick layers of any sort of wood chip mulch is generally not a great thing. The layers should be relatively shallow, because you can create a scenario if it's too thick where actually you stop water from penetrating into the soil and the roots and create local droughts. It's also better we think, to source wood chip from a similar species of tree to the tree being mulched, or at least the same family. In practice, that can be quite difficult. We find it in the UK pretty hard to source really good wood chip mulch. There needs to be some better supply line set up, I think. And obviously, it should not come from trees that have been felled due to disease. So here's some sort of brief findings from some of the applications of these techniques. So the first one, this is a park in London, which we applied mulch and I think it's just mulch on this tree for a period of about 3 or 4 years. The soil in the picture in the bottom right is taken from same sort of area, but just outside of the drip line of the tree. Here, where you can see we've got wheel ruts and clearly compaction. You can see from the coarse angular blocks of the soil that it's very compacted. It's a little bit grey, so there might be a bit of glaying going on there, maybe some waterlogging. And then you compare that with the soil immediately under the wood chip. 3 years later, already we've got a much better tilth. We've got much more air pores. It's clearly a much healthier soil. Even the colour looks better. And then these are some pictures from some aerated compost tea treatments that we did on an oak. The ones on the left are aerated compost tea only, and then the ones on the right are compost tea and wood chip. And you can see that over the 3 years from baseline, we've definitely got better growth on both trees, thicker, better crown density. It's difficult to entirely conclude from these photos and from our observations, because obviously lots of things can affect the health of a tree canopy. It is ephemeral, it's different every year. But the trends that we've been seeing have been pretty positive. So although our studies are nascent and we're still sort of feeling our way, we are getting somewhere, but we do feel that we need a bit more help to establish some soil health parameters for trees and to interpret the results that we're getting. I think as a community, we all need to, on our boriculture community, we probably all need to skill up a bit, and that includes me. And we need to put soils at the heart of our practice, that we are going to need help from soil specialists on that front. And our director, Neville Fay, when I did that. So he was looking for answers to these questions. And in so doing, he came across an awful lot of other people in various walks of life who were also concerned about soil degradation, some of them from an arboricultural point of view, from tree disease point of view, and others for other reasons. And he found that soil scientists and academia, farmers, biodiversity experts, even people from our National Environment Agency were all really concerned about soils, but sort of didn't really know what to do about it. And so sort of accidentally, he formed an organisation, almost a movement, if you like, which was first called Soils in Crisis and is now called the Sustainable Soils Alliance. I'm just going to spend the last couple of minutes just talking very briefly about this organisation and what it has achieved in terms of policy around trees. So some of it's sort of directly related to arboriculture. I mean, it all is ultimately, I suppose, because it's soil. But hopefully it might also inspire you a little bit how arboriculture could potentially lead in this field. We don't have to wait for other people to sort of beat the drum. So the Sustainable Soils Alliance has got two main objectives. The first is to restore soils to health within 1 generation, which is pretty ambitious. And the second is to elevate soil as an equivalent priority alongside air and water. So air and water, traditionally in the UK and also in the EU, and partly as a result of us being in the EU, we've got some really good standards and laws around air and water quality now, but we don't have anything similar for soil, even though it's just as important. So achieving this is going to mean engaging with an awful lot of different stakeholders, so government, farmers, industry, academia. But there is some benefit in doing that, not only because we might only have 100 harvests left and all our trees are dying, but also just because of the cost that soil degradation and problems can create. So it's just a few statistics for you here. So it's been estimated that soil degradation costs £1.2 billion a year in England and Wales. I'm afraid I'm not going to do any cross-currency conversions for you because my mental arithmetic isn't that good. 30% of soils degraded across the world. Almost 3 million tonnes of topsoil eroded annually, and massive costs from the cleanup related to nitrogen fertilizers. So it's clearly huge problems that need to be overcome. So the challenge then in the Sustainable Soils Alliance was to build a community around all these different people that were involved with soil that previously did not really talk to each other. It was kind of a siloed community. And also to develop a clear policy framework in governments to regulate and manage soils, because that hadn't really been in place before. And also to depolarize the debate a little bit. There was a lot of sort of tension between organic, non-organic, and different communities sort of wanting different things. So the idea was to bring it all together. And the idea is that the Sustainable Soils Alliance will become a hub that coordinates all of the various soil stakeholders who previously didn't talk to each other. In the UK, we do have some opportunity now that we've left the European Union. Obviously, we've left the Common Agricultural Policy too, which would have been largely responsible, certainly in agriculture, for determining how soils were managed. And we have to find something to replace that now. So it's a good opportunity to be able to feed into that process. And there's been some successes already. So in 2019, I think it was, DEFRA, which is the UK Department of the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, they published their 25-year environment plan, and partly through the auspices of the SSA, managed to get soils in there. So one of the policies is to ensure that the nation's soils are sustainably managed by 2030, which is pretty ambitious given that we're now in 2021. But it's positioned soils as a really important resource for all sorts of reasons. Last year, then following on from that, the government promulgated the new agriculture bill, which, as I said, will replace our involvement with CAP. And in that, there's this concept of paying public money for public goods. And it's given the government the power to fund soil health monitoring and management as a public good, which means that landowners, forest owners, farmers can now apply for funding for good management of the soil and monitoring of the soil, which is fantastic. Those initiatives and policies and laws mainly cover rural soils and farming and agriculture, so not so much in there about urban soils, and that's something I think that a lot of us will be doing with urban soils more than we will with rural soils. So recently we've set up a sort of offshoot of the Sustainable Soils Alliance, which is called the Sustainable Urban Soil Health Initiative, or SUSHI for short, because it's a bit of a mouthful. It's a small group at the moment. It comprises arboriculturists, a soil scientist, some local authority staff, and a couple of landscape architects. And we've got two key aims. The first is, just initially anyway, the first is to rewrite the Construction Code of Practice for the Sustainable Use of Soils on Construction Sites, which is a DEFRA document that was published around 5 or 6 years ago, to update that and then to try and get it have more traction, because it's not something that developers in particular pay much attention to. I'm sure a lot of us have been on construction sites looking at tree matters, and the soil has been completely ruined by the passage of very large plant and materials in weather that wasn't suitable. And you think, they're going to build these houses and they're going to plant some trees in the green space, and are they really going to thrive, because the structure of these soils has been completely ruined? So that's the first objective. And then the second is to get soil requirements a part of local authorities' planning policies in the UK, which means that local authorities will be able to hold developers to account and ask them to ensure that they sustainably manage the soils on any sites that they're developing. So if anybody's interested in this, Cardiff Council have developed an excellent soils and development supplementary planning guidance document, which really could be used as a blueprint for other councils to adopt to help to improve the situations with our urban soils. So that's SUSHI, and that's the Sustainable Soils Alliance, and some of the policy objectives that have come out of that. If anybody's interested, there's a lot of really good information on the Sustainable Soils website, including a soil library and lots of resources about soils if you're just interested in learning a bit more. And then finally, on our TreeWorks website, we also have a guide to taking soil samples, which is the PDF version of this booklet, which is absolutely free, and it's just there aimed at people in our industry and beyond to help them look at how to take soil samples and analyse the soil. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Claire. And we've certainly got plenty of questions. My God, like we've got more than 40 questions in so far. So I think there's going to be some filtering to be done. I apologise, as always, to everybody who's not going to get a question asked. But we do have, it says 644 people watching at the moment. So very popular, and we're not going to be able to get through all of the questions. So, Claire, brilliant stuff. Thank you very much. And we will now hand straight over to Emma. Emma, it's your turn. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, John, for inviting me to talk today at this Soil and Trees webinar. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today to talk to you about something that I'm very passionate about. Hopefully you'll find some things from this talk useful, and I'm very happy to talk for a while on the subject, so please send as many questions as possible. On a similar theme to Claire, one of the main reasons that I became inspired to work with soil is learning about what a diverse organism the soil is in general. So like Claire mentioned, I too learned about the number of organisms in soil, and that in a mugful of healthy soil, there are more organisms than there are human beings on the planet. There are around 10 billion organisms in a single mugful of healthy soil, which for me is just completely mind-blowing. So it was really inspiring to then work with soil and learn all about this incredible habitat and ecosystem. So my background is in nursery plantmanship and horticulture, and I then specialised in arboriculture in my undergraduate dissertation, and had the opportunity to then work with Dr. Glyn Percival in the UK at the Bartlett Tree Research Laboratory. He took me on as a summer student, and I then stayed. I didn't leave. I carried on working there, and I've been working with the company now for 9 years. So that's been a really, really wonderful experience. And my main research areas of interest are biochar, soils in relation to trees, especially those planted in urban environments, and then I'm now starting to move more into branch biomechanics. But you've probably heard of the company, so I work for Bartlett Tree Experts in their research laboratory division. They were founded in 1907, and they really are focused on scientifically based tree and shrub care. So one thing that we really want to focus on at the research lab is treating trees holistically, not just treating one problem, but looking at the overall health of trees from a scientific based approach. And part of that is looking down. So we really want to be looking down at the soil environment and the root health, as well as looking up at the tree canopy. So what is soil? Claire mentioned in depth already what a soil is, so I won't dwell on this too much. But these are the ideal proportions of a soil in terms of the mineral content, the air and water, so that porosity of the soil, and then the organic matter. So ideally, you're looking at about 50% porosity to contain roughly half of that air and half of that water, and then 45% mineral with around about 5% organic matter in that soil. And I'm not going to dwell on this too much also, but these are the 3 components of soil that I'll probably be referring back to during my presentation. So we have the biological component, which is any kind of life in the soil, anything from fauna like worms, earthworms, to right the way through to microbes and bacteria and fungi. We then have the chemical, which obviously involves a lot of the nutrients and the availability of different minerals in the soil. And then the physical, so the physical characteristics of that soil profile, the density, the aeration, so the porosity. So I'll refer back to these throughout my presentation. So now that we've kind of covered basics of soil, let's talk about soil and trees. So we can see from this slide that there's a huge amount of diversity in that root architecture under the soil. This has been excavated. This is not a normal looking tree. This has been excavated using an air spade. But it's just to give you an idea of those anchor roots, those major roots that are used for stability in the soil, for anchorage. And then some different lateral roots, which are also somewhat for anchorage, but for seeking out nutrients and water and other essential things for the plant growth and health. And then the more fibrous roots in different sizes, which are the main ones that exchange moisture, nutrients, and interact with different microorganisms like mycorrhizae. So there's a real diversity in the root system. We want to really promote, especially that fibrous root matter when we're thinking about managing soil with trees. A forest soil is very nutrient rich. So if we think about what a forest soil looks like, there's a lot of nutrient replenishment. There's a lot of movement in that soil from different organisms like the earthworms we can see here. And just the that replenishment, that cycle that's going on, the cycling of nutrients and moisture. We have different canopy levels. We have the upper canopy. We have lower shade loving plants. So there's a real balance in this ecosystem that means that trees prosper in their natural environment. But then when we think about urban soils, we're looking at soils that are very variable. There's a high amount of variability in the characteristics of this soil. So there tends to be quite a lot of the native subsoils that we find in the top horizons of the urban area soil. There's various structural elements that we can talk about. So there's often pans. If there's been a lot of compaction, there could be much less aeration in that soil. We're often going to have lower organic matter because we're not getting that replenishment of nutrients from that leaf litter and from that nutrient cycling that we would see in a forest soil. And as I've mentioned, compaction is obviously a very, very big issue in urban environments, as well as variations in soil temperatures. With the impermeable surfaces that we see, with different surface coverings that are different from a forest soil, we're going to see a lot more extreme soil temperatures, be it either in the winter causing winter injury, those freezing temperatures, but also more extreme higher temperatures in the summer with the urban heat island effect. And then, of course, foreign materials. So we're likely to see materials coming in from either construction, things like tires sometimes, tarmac, a lot more gravel. So that's all going to alter that soil profile and ultimately those three different components of the soil, the biological, the chemical, and the physical. So one thing that's really important to talk about with soil is glomalin or glomalin-related soil proteins. So glomalin or glomalin-related soil proteins are a product that's mainly produced by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which is a type of fungi that lives in the soil and is associated with root systems of trees. And these produce this product called glomalin as protection for the hyphae of the AMF, the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. But it also has a huge purpose in soil. So there's a lot of benefits to having this glomalin in the soil. It acts as a glue. It helps with aggregation. It is essentially a type of organic matter. So there's a huge amount of roles that glomalin play, especially in improving soil fertility. And this is something that I only learned about within the last couple of years, but I think it's quite important to mention in relation to building a healthy soil profile. So we really want to maximize not only the nutrient availability for the trees, but also these mycorrhizal fungi and other beneficial microbes that help to build the soil health. So looking at the mineral part of a soil, this is a soil texture triangle. You may have seen this before. It's quite a familiar concept to many, but essentially this is a diagram that you can use to analyze what kind of soil that you have. So if you know the different percentage contents of those three different components from a mineral standpoint, so clay, silt, and sand, then you're able to determine what your soil texture is as a classification, as a label. You can do this through laboratory tests. So there are different sieves that can be used to separate out those different size particles to determine what components you have. Or you can use this flowchart, which is a soil texture feel flowchart that you can use in the field. I know the font is very small. You're not going to be able to read necessarily what it's saying during this presentation, but I just wanted to include it as a visual to show you that this is available on the web. So if you Google or do an internet search of soil texture flowchart, you'll easily come across some of these processes that you can use. And essentially it involves taking some of that soil sample, putting it in your hand with a little bit of water, just enough to wet it to make a paste, and then following the instructions through the flowchart. And it's relatively easy to determine the soil texture. It takes a little bit of practice sometimes, but it's a good indication rather than, going full force with a laboratory test. So as I mentioned, air and water in soil are very important. We want to make sure that those are present for good root health. So we need good gaseous exchange with the roots, and we need that moisture availability, obviously, for the plants, for many different functions within the tree or the plant. And we also need that air and moisture for the microbial life in the soil. It's essential for some of that life to have oxygen. Some of it is anaerobic and doesn't need oxygen, but it's a very important component of soil, and we really want to make sure that we have that nice 50% porosity and roughly 25% air, 25% water to really optimize that environment for the roots. But as we can see here with this mower and this pedestrian, compaction can occur even from just a few passes of a mower. And compaction is the force that's applied to the soil that then leaves that air space, that porosity at a lower level. So it's removing that nice aeration that we have in the soil, and making those particles or those minerals or the organic matter that bit more closely packed together, so it increases the density. So we really want to minimize compaction and improve porosity where possible. And one way we can assess this compaction is by using either a bulk density meter or an auger. As Claire mentioned, I fully support having augers in the soil testing kit, or having an arborist soil assessment kit. So any way that you can take a soil sample, or a core preferably, that's not been disturbed on its way out of the soil, because we really want to maintain the density of the soil. So taking a core like the one in this photograph that's of a known volume, so of a known size. And in doing this, we can dry weight that soil, we can take that known volume, and we can calculate the compaction level through which is known as bulk density. And the unit for that would be grams per centimetre cubed, or whatever the appropriate unit is in the country that you are joining us from.
So as I've mentioned, a lot of what I'm talking about and hoping that will be most applicable to you are working with urban tree pits. And as you can see, it's obviously a very limited soil volume. So we really want to maximize the benefits out of that soil, be it through amendments, through these watering bags, or different methods. And this is an example of a lot of different methods that are being implemented to improve irrigation or water input, and also to improve the soil organic matter and content. So I'll go into these a little bit more. We really want to identify what the goal is when we want to manage our soil. Are we looking at an existing tree or a veteran tree even? Or are we looking at a new planting? Because the demands or the goals for these trees will be completely different. So that's definitely something very important to consider. For an urban tree, we're probably looking at trees that are recently planted, especially these kind of street trees. So promotion of growth may be a goal, although we want to make sure it's sustainable growth and it's not a sudden explosion of shoot growth. We want to make sure that the root growth is also balanced. We might want to correct for a deficiency, which I'll go into a little bit later. Or we may want to maintain the health of an existing tree or compensate for some damage, either from pests, diseases, or perhaps some root damage if there's been some construction or the compaction. Or perhaps we're hoping to maximize flowering potential if it's an ornamental tree. And obviously that should not sacrifice the overall health of the tree. We shouldn't prioritize those flowers at the expense of the overall health. But we do have ways with fertilization to sometimes promote flowering. So it's very important to bear your goals in mind. So the first one I want to talk about is soil moisture. Soil moisture has many different roles within the plants, as we're all probably very aware. Everything from germination right the way through to keeping those cells turgid, to be used in photosynthesis and for nutrient transport. And we really want to keep the moisture in the soil at around about fill capacity. So somewhere in between the pores being entirely saturated and there's not much air content in there, and wilting point, so completely dry or almost completely dry and unavailable to plants. So any ways we can analyze that and maintain that, then we should be interested in doing that. One of the most primary ways you can do in the field is to take one of those soil cores and use feel and use the visual assessment. So if there's a lot of glaying, if you can see there's been some oxidation of ions, is that rusting, things like that, then you'd be looking at more of a saturated soil. And obviously we can feel if a soil is drier or lacking in moisture. You could also take a soil sample and just dry that soil sample out and weigh before drying and after. And if you know the volume of that soil, then you'll be able to tell the water content per either grams per centimeter cubed or whatever unit you're using in your different countries. It's been a great learning curve moving from the UK system to the Imperial American system. Nutrients obviously are very important for tree establishment, for tree growth. They've all got very different roles to play. There's a large amount of interaction between these different nutrients. And not only that, but sometimes even if those nutrients are present in the soil, they may not be accessible. That moisture may not be there to make them available. The pH may be incorrect for the species and may be locking up some of those nutrients. So it's very important to bear these other things in mind, even if you analyze and you find that the nutrients are present. And also root disease can affect uptake. So even if you have that nutrient present in the soil, the uptake may be affected if the roots are damaged. So bearing all of these things in mind. So as I said, you can see all these different roles of these different nutrients. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. We haven't got too much time today. But I just wanted to highlight some of the real essential roles of these minerals and nutrients. So how can we analyze for these? As a company, we do collect soil samples and we analyze them in a laboratory. This is the most accurate way to analyze nutrient content and nutrient availability. So seeing how available those nutrients are to the plant, how exchangeable they are, the cation exchange capacity. You can get kits for pH in the field. So there are like litmus papers. You may remember that from school. There are other pH probes, pH kits you can use in the field. And these will give a good indication. But I would say for maximum accuracy, you really want them to be laboratory assessed. And then also for that texture, you can get them assessed in a laboratory as well. So you can assess the bulk density, the texture, and they can use sieves to separate out those different fractions of soil and get it really precise. But it depends entirely on your goal. So if you're an arborist in the field, I'm just trying to introduce some methods that are more practical. So if we want to alter the soil, the first thing I would say is assess the soil, as I've been hammering on this whole time. Make sure you know exactly what you're working with. Don't assume that just by adding more organic matter, the problem will be solved. There's such a diversity of issues, especially in the urban environment, that could be affecting the tree. As I've said, if you're seeing nutrient deficiencies in the leaves, it doesn't always mean that the nutrients aren't there. So it's very important to do those assessments. Primarily, don't alter that soil if you can help it. Plant the right tree in the right place. It's so much easier to select a tree that's designed for the environment than it is to try and alter the soil profile from those three components perspective: the physical, the chemical, and the biological. As I've said, it's such a fine balance, and trying to alter those without affecting something else consequentially as collateral damage is very difficult sometimes. However, if we do want to alter the soil, if we know we have a particularly degraded soil, especially in urban environment, there are products and amendments we can use, and there are techniques that we can put into place to use as arborists. I was very pleased to see Claire discussing mulch. This is the number one amendment I would recommend. Ideally, you would like a surface covering of something like bark chips, composted matter, leaf litter, something organic. There are other mulches, or what we would class as mulches, that are artificial, but I would say those are not usually appropriate in an urban setting, mostly because they can sometimes reduce penetration or infiltration of air and moisture. And with these biomass mulches, you're going to be getting replenishment of nutrients as an addition to suppressing weeds and having lots of different benefits, which I'll discuss in a minute. So aim for a biomass, some kind of either fresh or composted woody material, preferably 5 to 10 centimeters around the tree, all the way to the drip line. I would emphasize that you do want to make sure the root collar is unburied. So one of the things I'll discuss a bit later on as well is making sure that that zone, that root collar that I'll point out, is unburied and is not making contact with the soil. And also making sure you avoid dyed mulches. I've seen a few of these come up over the years just because they look nice aesthetically for customers and for retailers. I would avoid those completely. You just don't know what kind of chemical components would be in there. There are many benefits of mulch. So it's a direct supply of organic matter and nutrients. It can eliminate competition from turf or from weeds. It can help to conserve moisture, prevent erosion. It can help to moderate that soil temperature that I mentioned on. It can reduce compaction, and it would also mean that there was no need for a mower in that region, so then it would reduce mower damage. So I can't stress enough, mulches are a big favorite of mine. In addition to that, as I've mentioned, the root collar being buried, you may need to excavate that area. You can hand excavate as long as you're being careful not to do any damage to that woody tissue. But as a company, we use air excavation to help to remove the soil from around that root collar without damaging roots with a physical implement. Being careful to check for girdling roots as well and circling roots. So in that region, we can sometimes find circling roots. And these over time can actually girdle the stem or girdle some of the major roots, which could restrict uptake of moisture and nutrients, and could also just cause physical damage, which could lead to diseases moving in. So it's better to try to maximize outward spreading roots and getting that nice flaring out root collar to a nice root architecture coming out of that. The girdling roots, we have recommended cutting in the past. It's very much on a case-by-case basis. And when you buy tree stock, quite often, if you uncover the stem, sometimes with nursery stock, it's already being buried in the pot, where just with the repotting process, it's added to each time. And sometimes the depth can get more and more. So it's really important to check that base of the trunk to make sure that it's not covered, because that moist environment is not very preferable for those cells in that trunk to root environment. As I've mentioned, air compression, air tilling and cultivation. So we use an air spade as a company just to loosen the soil, but minimize root damage. We could use this to actually incorporate the amendments into the soil. And something I think Claire did touch on, but the root depth tends to be quite shallow. So there are deeper roots, but the majority of roots will be in the top layer of soil, be that 60 centimeters, a meter, it depends on the species. But you really want to focus the amendment on that top layer to maximize your input economically and with the tree. So which products? This is always something that's quite overwhelming. There are some amendments more so used in nursery production, but things that are used to aerate the soil and reduce compaction and increase drainage. So some of these things like perlite and vermiculite. Then we have ashes, wood ash. That's been something I've come across before. There are some of these products that are like hormones and vitamins. There's compost teas, there's humic acid. I wouldn't advise against these. I just have never found a hugely beneficial use with them. They're very good at increasing the fertilizer in the soil and the nutrient levels. But first and foremost, I would say mulch and compost. So one thing I didn't really mention was incorporating compost. And that's a big factor in improving those soils and allowing the microbial life to improve generally. And of course, I can't talk today without mentioning biochar. So I've been studying this for nearly 6 years now. It has very varied results. I would say that if you're going to apply biochar, you want to apply it with some kind of fertilizer or compost, because even though the biochar is very beneficial, it often doesn't contain a lot of nutrients itself. It's relatively inert. So you really want to be applying some kind of nutrient or something with nutrient value with that biochar. And very quick data graph here. So this is one of my, a real snapshot into some of the experiments I've done in the past. And this is just looking at different types of biochar. And all I wanted to say here really was that not all biochars are created equal. Much alike with any kind of amendment, there will undoubtedly be some variabilities between different products. And one of the things we found were that wood-based biochars, so the softwood, Namibian acacia hardwood, and the British hardwood, were the best performing for improving plant available water in soils. So this is just one snapshot. As I've mentioned, the effects will be very different depending on the soil type. This was in a clay loam soil. So it already had a reasonably good moisture availability. But you can see from the control that there were some significant differences with adding the biochar. So there can be some merit using it in various different examples. But we've seen improvements from biochar in roots, use efficiency of the water. So we actually have found a decrease of root mass with using biochar in the past, which we suspect could be because the resource allocation with a tree is not being used to further root production. It could be being used for defense systems, for shoot production, for energy production. But it's not being allocated to the root systems because it's not required to access those different nutrients and moisture. And in those trials, the above ground leafy tissue and woody tissue was maintained with health. So that was a very interesting finding. But I could go on about biochar for a while, so let's move on. Irrigation in some cases is valid. It's very difficult in an urban environment in a street environment. So this could potentially be more of like a back garden situation, but it can be useful to improve irrigation in dry seasons with tree establishment. So in that first initial period when the roots are often compensating for damage that's happened during the planting or transportation process. But it's very important to emphasize, especially if your clients or someone else is going to be maintaining these irrigation systems, so applying the irrigation, it's very important to emphasize that it shouldn't be run constantly. This is not just to be applied, every day. It's very much as and when needed. It's very important to reassess the soil, to look at the moisture levels and not just assume that the tree needs moisture, because quite often we see in our experience, trees are over irrigated. So they're oversaturated. You then actually get more root damage. So it's not always beneficial. So it's very much case by case scenario or situation. And the type of irrigation is very important. So we would usually use drip or soaker rather than overhead, just because sometimes overhead can encourage disease if there's an increase in moisture in the canopy of the plants. But it depends on the situation. And then, of course, on the other end of it, drainage and aeration. So if we do have a saturated soil or if we do have a compacted soil, we may want to implement some drainage or aeration, either through some trenching and placing different products in there like the PVC or something to improve the movement of water through the soil. I'm not going to dwell on this too much as it's not something I have a great deal of experience with, but it is possible to improve the soil and improve drainage on a larger scale if needed. And then finally, quite applicable to urban soils is reducing soil pollutants and salinity. So one of the things I mentioned earlier on was that contaminants can quite often make their way into tree pits. And there are some different types of plants that can draw some of these out of the soil. Obviously, this is not very applicable in an urban environment. You're not going to be able to necessarily grow a row of sunflowers underneath a tree to take up heavy metals. But it's just one option for trying to reduce the salinity and pollutants in the soil. There's the option for leaching through. Biochar has shown potential to remove some of those contaminants from the soil in terms of their accessibility and availability. They will lock up those contaminants, but it depends on the contaminant, whether it's a heavy metal. So it's very much case by case basis. If you wanted to assess the soil for pollutants or salinity, you can send that away for an analysis at a laboratory, or you can do what we call a bioassay, which essentially is growing or trying to germinate seeds in that soil. You would have a control soil, a compost or John Innes or something, and then you would have the soil you wanted to analyze. So you would try to germinate the seeds in both of those soils and just visually observe to see what the rate of germination is. And it's a very, very basic test to look for some of these pollutants. And just this slide to emphasize that all trees are different. So this cypress is located next to a body of water. It is specially adapted to create these beautiful knees, which are designed to improve gas exchange in these environments. And this tree would not do well, typically, in an urban environment, just because of these knees and its natural environment. So every tree is different, every environment is different, and it's very important to design your soil management for those conditions and for that tree species that you're desiring. So to summarize, make sure you're considering all three components of the soil: the biological, the chemical, and the physical. Where possible, select that right plant for the right place. Compost is often ideal, as well as mulch, a mulch layer. Removing grass from directly beneath the tree is always beneficial. You're removing contamination from any kind of weed and feed that could be applied, which we do see quite a lot from experience. And it also removes competition from the grass, and enriching the soil with the correct amendments for your situation. A good soil is a fine balance. There's no right answer, but there's a lot of resources out there, many of which Claire has mentioned, that are available to us to assist us in soil management. So I hope that's been interesting. If anyone, I'll pass back over to John.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Emma. Are my buttons actually coming undone, or am I doing some kind of, we talked about me stripping at the beginning and it wasn't. Apologies if anyone saw anything there that upset them. Right. Thank you, Emma. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Claire. We've got loads of questions, as I've said, and I've been sort of culling them quite mercilessly, and we've got even more questions. So, right, I do honestly try and make some notes and look at what I'm trying to do here. But okay, there's a question. Right, here's a question. I'm going to put this to both of you. I'll go to Claire first, and it's a question from Fee. And it feels so wonderfully controversial that I definitely want to ask it. Fee says, could we use soils from woodlands that have been cut down to improve the success of newly planted woodlands? Is there any evidence that this may work? And then Fee wants to clarify that she's very much against cutting down established woodlands. But that's interesting. In the UK, we've got famously quite a few woodlands being lost at the moment. Is there any opportunity to use that soil elsewhere?
That's a super interesting question, and actually not quite in the context of wholesale kind of woodland soil replacements, but I've been talking about it with my colleague at the Soil Biolab, whether it would be possible, and we are going to run some trials on this, but we haven't done so yet, not perhaps to transfer the whole soil, because I think in order to do that, it would probably become too disturbed, although I'm not an expert on that, so maybe it would be okay. But to actually try and sort of distill out the biological aspects of the soil, amplify that in the same way that we do when we're brewing compost tea, and then apply that to the donor soil, to the recipient soil. We actually looked at it in relation to a project that we're working on that relates to the transplanting of a tree from one type of soil to another type of soil that's slightly different. And we looked at whether that's a technique that we can use. So the answer is the jury's out. I don't know. I think it's a fantastic idea, and it's something that's also occurred to us. Whether practically that's possible or not, I don't know. Maybe Emma does. Maybe this is something that Bartlett's have worked on, but it's certainly something we're gonna have a go at doing.
Thanks, Claire. Emma.
Good question.
I'm gonna try actually do it from my phone.
Okay, let me just do it from my phone. It'll be easier. So yeah, it's an excellent question. I love the theory. I agree with Claire that it would be a great source of inoculum. So you could use that forest soil to extract the organisms, or to even profile the organisms, so to see what it is that is established there. I'm not entirely sure that you could transplant the soil and it would just function the same way, much like Claire said. It's going to be a different environment potentially, different profile in the soil, different bedrock of the soil. So there's going to be a lot of different factors that could immediately alter that soil as it's transplanted. I know that some of my colleagues here in the US are starting to look at the community DNA analysis in soil to look into what is present. But we haven't actually looked into anything to do with transplanting the soil for the trees. But that would be extremely interesting to look into. So I'm going to make a note of that. Thank you for the question.
Can I just jump back in quickly with that as well, to say that, of course, I did say in my talk that it's the trees that create the woodland soils. So obviously, you know, how long that status persists for when you don't have trees and you're using it again for something else, I'm not quite sure. But, yeah.
Thank you very much, Claire. There really are so many questions. I should just clarify, as I always do, we'll send all of the questions to our panelists, and then if anyone wants to answer any particular questions, then they're free to do so. And if you've got anything burning you want to ask that I haven't asked, please email me, john@trees.org.uk, and I will do my best to get you an answer. Okay, there's so many good questions. I really like them. Okay, this is a good one from Raphael, who I believe is in Armenia. So welcome, Raphael. In our orchard, we have a high rate of pH. What is the best way to decrease it? So I'll ask Claire first, then I'll go to Emma afterwards. So decreasing pH.
Okay, this is not something I get very much involved with, actually, so I think I might nominate Emma on this one. I know a little bit about increasing it, but decreasing it I don't know so much about, so I'll pass that over.
Sure, no problem. So just by decreasing, I think you mean acidifying. If I'm wrong, please correct me. The major way that I'm aware of is through adding sulfur to the soil to increase that acidity. But I think it's very important to analyze what's in the soil first, just because sometimes the addition of sulfur can affect those other nutrients. As I mentioned, there's a lot of interaction there chemically. So I would say sulfur with hesitancy, and then potentially some acidic mulches could benefit, but the likelihood of that actually altering the pH of the soil is very low, just because of the pH buffering capacity of that soil. It may not alter that much.
Thank you, Emma. I hope that answered your question. Brilliant. Right. Okay. Sorry, I'm struggling because there's so many good questions. I know we haven't got that much time. Right. Let's go straight to another question that's for both of you from Piotr in Poland. Hi, mate. Hope you're doing well. What is the single most important soil parameter to measure soil health from the tree's point of view?
Can I have two?
Go on, you're allowed to.
They're related. I think personally, it's air and water. Those are the two most important parameters, I think, for trees. I mean, trees are pretty amazing. They'll grow. I mean, we know this from just looking at the landscape, in extreme places. They can grow in, they're pretty tolerant of infertility and sort of all sorts of other soil problems, depending on the species, obviously. But if there's insufficient soil moisture and there's insufficient air for gaseous exchange, and I can't choose between them because I think they're equally important. So I would say those two things.
Emma?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The porosity in general of the soil. Without that oxygen moisture, as you've quite rightly said, you're not going to get the nutrient uptake, you're not going to get root function in general. The tree is not going to be able to function without those. So it's really hard to narrow it down, but I would say that would be my choice too.
We've got agreement in the panel. That must be right. That's good enough for me. Okay. A couple of people have asked. Let me see if I can find the other question. Oh, it was both in the same minute, in fact. And I'll put this question to Claire first. We'll just keep going in that order for now. Maria and Drew have asked about putting mulch or leaf mold directly onto the grass. And does that cause a problem, or should you be looking to clear the grass before you put mulch on there? Claire?
Depends what mulch you're using, I think. If you're using something that creates sort of quite a layer that will remain for a reasonable amount of time. So if you're using something like wood chip mulch, you can just put it on the surface and it will get taken down. But provided that you've got a functional soil with, for example, lots of earthworms, if you're in a part of the world where it's an earthworm thing, you might be in a part of the world where it's termites or something else, but some sort of macro fauna that can pull it down along with the infiltration, you're fine to put it on grass. If you're using something that's a finer mulch, like for example leaf mold, I would say that probably you might want to just strip the turf off first, just because it hangs around for less long, and you really need that sort of suppression for a reasonable amount of time. And we all know, grass will grow where it can. It's pretty tough. So I think it depends on the type of mulch, but certainly it is possible.
Emma?
Yeah, absolutely agree. one of the things as well, everything that Claire said also, but one of the things as well is the thickness of the mulch. So I think we definitely recommend to go on the more than 10 centimeters thickness end of the scale, just purely to that same suppression that Claire mentioned. But yeah, definitely, if you've got something that's going to compost quite quickly, the grass is more likely to outcompete. So yeah, same answer.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, there's lots of questions about mulch, and I think we'll get back to some more mulch in a little bit. People love a bit of mulch. But right now, we're going to go, I believe, to Nepal and Atmaram. Hi, Atmaram. Good question here. Again, I'll go to Claire first and then over to Emma. Does climate change affect the nutrient release pattern, organic matter decomposition, and the nutrient metallization? What impact is there of climate change on the soil? Claire?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be, this is not my area of expertise, but I think it's going to be in a number of sort of different ways. So, for example, just on a temperature point of view, climate change is going to affect soil temperatures. So that's, most likely up to a certain level, up to a certain threshold, that's probably going to accelerate processes a bit, because the warmer a soil, the sort of more activity, the more, the more chemical sort of reactions and everything you have. I suspect that at some point, though, there's a threshold at which it's simply too hot and everything in the soil gets baked. So I would imagine from a temperature point of view, that would be super important. And then, of course, climate change changes all sorts of things. So it's changing the whole hydrological cycle, for example, when it rains, how much it rains. So those sorts of things are also going to alter nutrient release. And I'm pretty sure that as those changes start changing the soil, then that's going to also start changing the soil biota, the actual biological communities that live in the soil. So I think it's probably going to be pretty difficult to predict exactly how that's going to happen. I suspect that in some places it's not going to be wholly unfavourable initially, but in a lot of places that are already quite marginal, for example, it probably will be.
Thanks, Claire. Emma?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Great question too. Very, very timely. I think there's going to be a lot more extremes in general in the climate, which, as Claire has mentioned, is probably going to make things undesirable in the soil for the existing soil biota in some cases. But also slight increases in temperature do or could increase productivity of that microbial life in the soil. So I think it's going to depend very much how much change we see and how rapidly. And then also with more extreme weather events, there's more potential for erosion potentially if there's a lot of moisture coming or precipitation all in one go. So we could see some big alterations in the soil profile from a physical standpoint. And then that could affect the microbial life also. But yeah, it's very, very variable depending on where in the world and what climate change we're seeing.
Thanks, Emma. There's been a lively debate in the chat now about pH and whether if you raise or lower the pH, you're making the number higher or lower or the acidity higher or lower. It's all got a bit existential over there, but we'll let them get on with that. We'll focus on what we're doing. Okay, now that's what everyone's asking around there. Okay. There's too many questions. Right, let's ask another nice one that I like. And this is to both of you as well. Then we'll probably have some specific questions afterwards. Liz has pointed out that bonsai growers spend a lot of time researching and making sure that the soil they use on bonsai is the best possible for the health of the tree. Have either of you thought of, or do either of you work with the bonsai world to explore what they've identified as the best soil for each species of tree? Claire?
Not really. I mean, it's something that we've considered in terms of root management, but really only considered because I'm aware, the thought, not so much about soils actually, but about roots. The thought occurred to me that actually that sort of root management, nobody knows that better than the bonsai community. I'm not that knowledgeable about bonsai, so I wasn't aware, but I suppose it's logical that they would also seek to, look at certain soil parameters. So I haven't, but that's a really fantastic idea, and I'll definitely take that one away with me. So great question, thank you.
Emma?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Maximizing that small volume of soil to get what tree needs out of it, be it moisture, nutrients, or physical anchorage. But yeah, that's a really good point. I think along with that, with the root pruning that goes on with bonsais, I wonder if that would interact with that as well, in that you're physically reducing the root mass demand on that soil. But it's a really good point about whether we could alter the soil to more reflect that of bonsai trees. I myself killed a bonsai tree, so probably not the best person, but really interesting concept.
Thanks, Emma. Well, in the chat, so I'm trying to keep an eye on everything. Marco has asked, does the Arb Association have any lectures about bonsai? Well, yes, we do, Marco. We had Amelia Williams gave us a talk about bonsai, and it's jolly brilliant, and you should all watch it. It's on our website. Right, I was going to say, yes, well, I'll tell you what, Marco, that was such a nice opportunity for me to promote one of our talks. I shall ask you a question, which I also like. Marco asks, are there any particular natural ingredients we can use for adding nutrients to the soil for germination? The examples Marco's given, bird feathers, banana peels, someone's mentioned sheep wool in the chat. Claire, what about natural things to improve the soil?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we're all about sort of the natural, but I think you have to be careful what's natural, because I don't think banana skins in a UK woodland soil, for example, would be particularly natural. So yeah, there's a whole host of things that you can use. I think people do use sheep wool sometimes to try and sort of improve structure. I can't say that's what we've done. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities. I would say to look for something that's going to be most similar to the soil that you're trying to recreate or sort of create. I guess in terms of germination, there's probably lots of products that you can use to kind of try and boost that. And I'm not so hot on that sort of thing. I sort of deal with mature plants more. But I would always say to be, particularly if you're putting that in the environment. Obviously, if you're growing something in a seed tray, it doesn't really matter what you do. But if you're actually putting something into the wider environment, I think the precautionary principle definitely applies, because we're sort of playing a bit, and there's not a lot of knowledge out there. So you want to try and do the most good with the least disturbance and the least harm. That's why we use compost tea, really, because it's pretty, it either doesn't do anything or it does, and that's pretty much it. It doesn't really do the type we use anyway. We don't think it really does any harm or really disrupts things. So that would be my advice.
Thanks, Claire. What do you think, Emma? Yeah,
so one of the favourite lines of my colleague, Dr. Glyn Percival, is eye of newt, no, wing of bat, eye of newt. And similar theme, you definitely want to be careful about what you're putting into the soil, because ultimately it could be there for many years. It could be, a very long life there in the soil. Biochar, obviously, is something I've worked with a lot, and it is an organic amendment. I would say it is worth applying in degraded soils where there's a lack of organic matter, a lack of moisture retention, more that end of the scale. So I would definitely recommend that amendment for certain situations. Compost as well, as we've talked about. But other than that, there's no real organic amendments I've come across that I would recommend for all situations. There's some different variations in between. But as a company, we're always very intrigued by new products. We've had some terracotta products we've added to the soils, and we're always very careful to test for phytotoxicity, so to see what the effect will be on the plants before putting any of those in. So yeah, it's very important to bear that in mind.
Thanks, Emma. So just to confirm, Glyn Percival is recommending we use bats as mulch. That's fine. Sorry, Glyn. I know, Glyn, you wouldn't suggest that. I'm sorry, Glyn. I'm teasing. Okay, we have got a good question here from Daniel, who I know is over in Israel. Hi, Daniel. Thank you for joining us again. Daniel is asking about artificial lawn and synthetic turf. Daniel's saying, can you elaborate about the effects of artificial lawn or synthetic turf on the soil and the quality of the soil and on the root zone as well around trees? Claire, what do you think about artificial turf?
Yeah, I again don't know huge amounts about it, but as I understand, I mean, there's a number of things there, isn't there? I'm presuming is it porous artificial turf, or is it sort of once you put it down, it's capped off. I don't really know, but obviously it's going to affect anything that's happening below it in the soil. So it's going to affect the temperature of the soil below. It's going to affect water and air infiltration. I think normally when it's laid, you have to have a reasonably sort of thick course of sand above it. So that's going to change all of those things as well. So I would imagine it's probably going to have a deleterious effect, a negative effect in the long term, just because it's not soil and the surface is not the same as it would be, if you were an open landscape. Whether it's any worse than something like having block paving or tarmac up against trees, I don't really know. But for sure, it will change to a certain extent the processes that are going on below that.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. It will change the processes that are going on within that soil. And similarly, if you can, I would still try to leave some sort of tree circle or bed around that tree, which is a mulched area. So even if you have the artificial lawn or artificial grass, it would be beneficial to leave a tree circle. But yeah, same things that Claire's been saying about that alteration of the soil characteristics.
Thank you. Terry has very naughtily suggested, what about using anyone who lays plastic grass as mulch? Terry, that's a terrible thing. So I'm sure.
I think, if you chip them up small enough, I think that's absolutely acceptable.
Okay, well, there's enough chat about dead cats without it going on to anybody else. Okay, now I'm going to ask a question. The time is flying. It's just zooming by today. I will ask a question about compost tea to Claire. Which one was I going to look at? It was this one from Rob. Could compost tea be painted onto trees when, say, a willow has been pollarded or a tree that's had to be topped for risk factors? Would there be any benefit to painting compost tea on those big wounds?
No, I'm not sure that would really have the effect that we're looking for. So the way that it works when we apply foliar mist spray to trees is that it takes up the sort of the moisture and the microbes to a certain extent either pretty much just stick to the leaves. And then sort of the nutrients and the water is taken in through the stomata. So I'm just trying to think what would happen with the cut end of a tree. I mean, the minute you cut it, you've got embolism, haven't you, of the vessels. So I'm not really sure whether then that would actually penetrate, and it's sort of not getting to the right bits either. So I would suspect that it probably wouldn't do any harm, but I suspect that it wouldn't necessarily do anything beneficial. That's a sort of off the cuff because I'd never thought of that before. So,
see, the ideas are flying around all over the place. Okay, that was a question about compost tea for you. I've got a question about biochar for Emma. There's been lots of questions about compost tea, biochar, and we've only got time for a couple on each. But Naomi, as ever, is putting forward a slightly maybe controversial perspective. Naomi is asking Emma, have you seen the research on biochar that suggests that the environmental costs of production exceed the benefits?
Interesting. I don't know which particular research you're referencing to, but I definitely want to flag that as a really valid point. We definitely want to encourage biochar production from something that's already a waste product if possible. So a large amount of our biochar that we use as a company comes from trees that are being taken down because of in Colorado, from pine beetle kill. So the trees are already dead. So we are utilizing that wood product to produce the biochar. And the same in Namibia. So the Namibian acacia biochar I mentioned is an invasive species that they're clearing from rangelands in Namibia. So they're just producing the biochar from those materials. So yes, really valid point. I haven't seen that research. I'd be very interested to read that. But yes, very important to emphasize that.
Thanks, Emma. I'm sure Naomi will send over the research. Thanks, Naomi, for that question. Okay, someone else who always asks fantastic questions. Anthony. Anthony is asking, how do structural soils used for improving the root environment for trees differ from natural soils? We're often hearing about the benefits of structural soils and using them in tree pits. Claire, have you got any opinion on structural soils? And then I'll come to you, Emma, afterwards.
Have I got some opinions on structural soils? Maybe I should just sort of put my filter on here. So first things first, I don't personally think they should be allowed to be called soils because they are not. They're growing media or structural media, but they're very, very different. So of all the processes that go into making a soil, one of the most important ones is time, and it takes literally thousands of years to create really good soil. Structural soils, it's kind of putting everything together in a kind of a recipe and a mixture. And there can be a number of problems with them. I understand why they're specified in certain environments. I personally think they're over-specified now. I would like to see people creating, landscape spaces where you can actually have proper soil, rather than trying to get everything in with tree pits and paving up to here, or we'll just put structural soil in, it will be fine. One of the problems that I think with structural soils is that although they're fed with organic matter when they're made, how long does that organic matter actually persist, particularly if you're then putting that structural soil in an area where it's the soil will then be the media will then be totally sealed off. So you don't really have any inputs of anything from above ground. And if you planted small trees, or you're not going to have very much fine root turnover either. So very quickly the organic matter gets exhausted and it's not replenished. So that can be a problem. They tend to be very low in soil biota and functionally, I guess over time, perhaps that would be, if there were sufficient organic matter input, that soil biology would build up. But certainly we're doing some tests on this, actually, a fairly long running project in a park in London. And we're finding that actually, it doesn't particularly improve very, very quickly. And there was something else I was going to say, and now I've completely forgotten what it was. Let's see if I can remember. Yeah, so low in biology. Oh, and the other thing is they tend to have quite high pH as well, and that's something to watch out for, because although a number of trees have got quite a large amplitude of pH conditions that they can tolerate, some trees don't like alkaline conditions, and they are pretty alkaline. When I say high, I mean high number, meaning alkaline, like pH 8, something like that.
Thanks, Claire. Emma, any thoughts on structural soils?
Yeah, so I do not personally have a great deal of experience with structural soils. I know that some of the previous research that my colleagues in the company have carried out have found that sand-based structural soils and gravel-based structural soils were not beneficial when looked at in a sidewalk or pavement environment. Sorry for our UK friends. That's been looked at the research lab here in North Carolina. However, the load-bearing cells did come out well in that trial. They did show some benefits for improving the tree health. I can't speak to actually applying that in the field. I don't have experience in that. But I am setting up a trial, hopefully this year, in Pennsylvania with the help of the company and some of the local companies, so Ecotone and other people in Pennsylvania, looking at Stockholm solution soil. Yes, I've just seen someone pop up Stockholm mix, perfect, which is essentially, just as Claire has mentioned, it's more of a media made from large aggregates and biochar infilling the areas in between the aggregates, and then incorporating more of a traditional tree pit with that, but having that extended area with the structural soil. So I would be excited to report on that in the future.
Thank you, Emma. I feel like we should really be finishing, but we still have like more than 400 people watching. And if you don't mind, we'll just ask a couple more questions and just kind of, they'll get bored. They'll go eventually. So lockdown, see, look at this, the beneficiaries of lockdown. Okay, we've got a few more questions. This might be quite a quick one. I'll ask this of Claire from Matthew says, no, we won't get bored. Fine, whatever.
Yeah, guys, come on.
I've got all day, Matthew. Okay, this might be a quick one. I'll ask Claire a question from Don. Should we be trying to discourage removal of natural leaf fall from grassed and soft ground?
Yes. I totally agree. I live in Bristol in the UK, and when I first moved here, I worked for the Parks Department of the local authority. And I remember being utterly horrified watching in the autumn teams of grounds maintenance personnel collecting up all of the leaves from the trees in the parks, putting them in plastic bags, and then taking them away to be incinerated. It's a crime. interestingly, if you're interested in how, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because people also want nice, pristine grass, and they think that the two things are not compatible. As long as you've got trees where the leaves are not particularly recalcitrant, so they'll break down relatively easily, I really don't think it's a problem. It's interesting, in Singapore, in the botanical gardens and the other parks in Singapore, they have really looked into this, and they've got a whole movement to try and dissuade people away from the expectation that all the leaves will be collected up. And actually, if you go to botanical gardens, they've even got signage and sort of interpretation boards about why they're leaving the leaves in situ. So absolutely, I will carry a banner if you want to start that campaign. I think you're absolutely right.
Emma?
Sorry, having some issues unmuting. Yeah, absolutely agree. I think that the collection of leaves and burning is just horrifying. I think any way we can naturally replenish nutrients should be way higher up on our radar than trying to just add fertilizers. I think natural is best for sure. So where possible, I think leaf matter should be left.
Thanks, Emma. On the same theme, it's a question I wanted to ask, and I didn't want to because there are so many other questions, but Andrew Parker, good name, Andrew, strong work, has mentioned this, that Victorian street trees in the UK don't appear to have much in the way of organic inputs, yet the trees survive. And this is something I wondered when I was managing trees on like Victorian Bankman, for example. They're completely encased in impermeable materials, hard surfacing, all the material that's grown every year, the bits that fall off are swept away. How are they defying what feels like everything I know about trees? Claire?
It's the below ground parts. I actually had a slide about this and then I took it out because it was a very long presentation this morning and I've considerably cut it down, you'd be pleased to know. So I said at the top of the presentation that the recycling of the below ground parts is really important. And actually, so that means fine root turnover, and fine roots, as we know, they can have a lifespan of anywhere between 7 days and 2 years. Then we've got the sloughing off of the cells from the permanent roots, and then we've got mycorrhizal turnover. And don't underestimate how important that is. So there was a study done in a poplar plantation in Italy, which found that all of the total soil organic matter in the soil, 62% of it was fine roots, old mycorrhizal fungi, and all of the other parts of the tree and its associates that I just mentioned. 62%. So that's what the input of organic matter is. And as long as your tree is healthy above ground and is able to sort of keep creating roots and turning them over and making that fine root cycle, I conclude, because I've asked myself that question a number of times, John, and then I sort of came across this information and it was a bit of a light bulb moment. It was like, that's where it's coming from. And also the exudates from the roots as well that I mentioned before. And of course, a lot of those trees were planted before everything was sealed over. So there is some sort of original soil down there, I think, somewhere that it's managing to exploit and then farming its own soil with its own below ground parts. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Claire. Emma?
Nothing to add too much. I've always wondered that myself. Similarly, I wondered if perhaps the soil conditions were better back in the Victorian age before the Industrial Revolution and that stage in history, and perhaps that now self-contained soil environment under the soil was already its own cycling situation. But yeah, I had also wondered that same thing. So I'm really happy to have had Claire's insight.
I'm very happy.
I think what you're saying there is absolutely correct. And actually, I did a little bit of a compare and contrast of old photos. I got into this quite recently. Old photos from sort of Bristol and trying to look at when a lot of those Victorian street trees were planted. It was that they were just planted in dirt, really, and there was nothing sealed over the top. So for the pivotal part of the tree's early life, it was growing in nice soil. Whether you could recreate that now with the trees that we plant in tree pits and tarmac up to the surface, I doubt, but that's another issue.
Thanks, Claire. I think Victorian Bankman in London is also helped by Bazalgette's sewer underneath, which is probably providing all sorts of organic matter that we won't look into. Right, okay, let's go to Emma for a quick question about biochar that two people have asked the same thing. Mirko's asked, how does biochar affect mycorrhiza? And Jonathan has expanded on that a bit with, could the extra availability of water and nutrients provided by biochar harmfully affect the mycorrhiza relationships between the tree roots and networks that have been providing it with extra usable soil?
Okay, so the biochar itself, from my experience, has encouraged microbial activity in the soil. I can't say specifically the effect on mycorrhizae, as I haven't looked at that in my experiments. However, I have seen in previous research trials that there are extensive results to say that biochar encourages hyphae production and that can actually act as a shelter for the fungi. I forgot the second part of the question. Would you mind repeating?
You say that as if I haven't immediately deleted it after I've asked it. It was, of course, could there be, because of the additional water and nutrients unlocked by biochar, could that then have an impact itself on the mycorrhizal associations that have developed over time?
Right, perfect. Well done. So the biochar itself doesn't contain a whole lot of nutrients. It's relatively inert. It depends on the biochar. If it's a high ash content biochar, something from agricultural waste or similar, then it will have quite a lot of nutrients. But otherwise, it tends to be just more of a physical structure and have a lot of chemical reactions with its surface area. But yes, I do think that increased nutrient availability through that increased cation exchange capacity will have some impacts on the tree roots and also the moisture in that soil. So the nutrients could potentially be taken up more by the plants, and then that moisture increase could potentially then benefit microbial life in the soil. It's a really great cycle.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, I reckon we can do like two more questions maybe, but there are so many good ones. Okay, let's throw this one at Claire. Moray's asked the question, are there any downsides to mulching, especially regarding veteran trees? And a couple of other people, here's Will. When constructing an urban soil, can you have too much organic matter? Similar question, can we have too much of a good thing?
Yeah, you can. I mean, you can definitely, too much organic matter is going to affect the texture as well, and it's also going to affect all sorts of things. Just from purely point of view, you can get really bad settlement if you have too much organic matter in the soil, because obviously it breaks down. So you think you've sort of filled your soil up to here, all the organic matter breaks down, and then all of a sudden your sort of roots are exposed because the soil is settled. You can definitely have too much organic matter. What was the first question was, can mulch be a bad thing? Absolutely yes. I think I touched on that in the talk, and I think Emma did as well. So if it's the wrong type of mulch, so if you use something, I'm not a big fan of bark mulch, I'm afraid, unless it's just purely to suppress weeds. I think it's it's a type of organic matter that's too recalcitrant. It's got too many extractives in. For veteran trees in particular, I don't think so. And when we do mulching with veteran trees, we're super careful to try and match the genus or the family to make sure that it's composted mulch. You don't want to put it too thick. I think there was an issue with the major oak at Sherwood, where they put some really coarse wood chip down about 10 years ago, really, really thick. I don't know what the provenance of the wood chip was, but it clearly wasn't the right type of wood chip for that tree and for those soils, which are pretty compacted and quite sandy, I think. And I think it was found to actually have had a deleterious effect, as I touched on in my talk, because it was actually impeding water from getting down to the trees. It was all getting held in the mulch layer. So that's absolutely not what you want. So it's absolutely not always the right thing. You have to be careful how you apply it, the texture of it, what it's made of, all of these things you have to consider very carefully. And it's not for every situation either.
Thanks, Claire. Emma?
Yeah, absolutely agree. And going back to the assessment that I mentioned, I think it's very important to assess what kind of soil characteristics you have, what's already there, rather than just adding organic matter. I think you can have two organic matter too. There's such a thing as too good of a thing. I think, yeah, we're aiming for around 45% as an optimal amount of organic matter. And in terms of the mulch, I do think that if you over apply, it can sometimes overwhelm. So one of the things I'm asked the most with mulch is typically how often do we reapply? And I think that goes hand in hand with the question of, can mulch be a bad thing? If you're reapplying mulch and there isn't enough soil biota or microorganisms to break down that mulch, or if there's none at all, like it's a very barren soil, then it's going to take a while for that soil profile to build and to degrade that mulch. So you definitely want to be mindful of how quickly it's going to be broken down. And very much like Claire said, the material that you're using is very much case by case, per tree and per site.
Thank you, Emma. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question and then we're going to do our old favourite. The question I want to ask, this is very broad, I'm sorry, you probably won't be able to answer this, but question from Jonathan, and I really like it. I'm going to ask Claire first and then Emma. Jonathan's saying, with soils in regard to arboriculture, what would you say is the next area where we most desperately need research? Claire, what should we be investigating next?
Yeah, well, it's sort of, I'm afraid my answer is probably going to be a little bit broad too, but it's what I was sort of saying in my talk, that we don't really have any baseline data. And it is difficult because all soils are slightly different. We don't really have any baseline data about what trees really like and what really encourages them to thrive for a long time. So one of the things that I'm really interested in doing, and if anybody wants to fund me doing it, I will accept donations, is to look at the soils of ancient and veteran trees which have been there for a very long time, and to just take some and look at it and see what it is about the soil that's allowed and encouraged these trees to persist for such a long time, because I think that will give us some really good information about the type of things that soil needs in all sorts of parameters, chemical, physical, biological. Great question though, and definitely, more funding is required. There's so much work to do.
Thanks, Claire. Emma, you're a researcher. You must have a massive list of stuff that you need to investigate. What's top?
I have an absolute laundry list. I'd say for me personally, one of the biggest things that I would like to look into is lessening toxic levels of metals or saline conditions in soil. So there's a lot of research out there already, but boron toxicity is particularly potent in my mind. There's no real answer. There are things we can do to ameliorate the soil and help improve leaching, but it's a huge problem all over the world. So that sticks out for me. And then very much like Claire said, everything to do with biological life in the soil just fascinates me. And it's something that I've not really been able to research just because of the equipment and the laboratory setup that would be required, either through, the respiring and the gaseous productions or through DNA analysis of the soil. So that's an area where I think, knowledge could be greatly improved.
Oh, I almost couldn't unmute myself there. Thank you very much, Emma and Claire. That was great answers. I think there's lots of stuff to investigate. I'll ask a very, very quick one because Jamie Myers asked this. Hi, Jamie. You'll shout at me if I don't ask a question. Emma, Jamie was just asking if your research on biochar has been published anywhere. Is it all available that we can share?
I do have one research paper that I published with Dr. Glynn. I can make that available. I have a PDF, which is on biochar alone, but also in use with molasses and fertilizers on transplanted trees, but it's in a field environment, it's not urban. But I will say I've nearly completed my PhD studies, and I'm currently in the process of publishing a review paper on biochar for the arboricultural industry in general, and then also 2 more research papers on some of this information. So I'll keep you posted.
Lots to look forward to. Thank you. Well, as I say, all the questions will be sent to our speakers. If you want to email me, john@trees.org.uk, I can pass your emails on and requests for papers and things we can deal with. Right, it's the big question. You've all been here for more than 2 hours, just waiting for this. Some of you just tune in for this. There'll be people just arriving at 8 o'clock just for this particular question, and we're going to ask it now. So do not fear. Claire, what is your favourite tree or associated subject book?
Okay, I'm a massive bibliophile and I've got a huge tree library. And as I said earlier, that would be like choosing my favourite child. I would find it very difficult. So this isn't so much my favourite, but in the context of what we've been talking about this evening, I think it's the one that I refer to the most in relation to soils and trees. Although not really specifically trees, but just soils generally. And then that is E.W. Russell's Soil Conditions and Plant Growth. Now, this was actually first published in, I think, 1919, and this is the 10th edition from the late 70s. I think there are subsequent editions. And I just found out actually yesterday when I was looking at this that there's a brand new rewrite, obviously not written by Russell because I don't think he's with us anymore. I don't have that one, so I don't know but that's worth it. But this is a fantastic tome. You can pick it up secondhand for song. Really recommend it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Emma, what's your choice?
Claire, I absolutely love that book as well. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. Mine is, I found this question very difficult as well, but I decided to go for the first book on soil in relation to plants and all ecology that really got me excited about the subject. So that is The World Beneath Our Feet, A Guide to Life in the Soil by James B. Nardi. And it's just a fascinating read. There's been some updates on the science since this book, but it's just very exciting to read about the life beneath our feet.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Good choices. As always, we will make sure that the book names are listed underneath the webinar when it's recorded and goes online. So you'll be able to see them soon. And if you saw in the last Art magazine, we actually listed the first, 25 odd webinars where we asked this question. We've listed all the books, all the speakers and all the books they've recommended in the Art magazine. So get hold of that. And if you haven't had the magazine, it's because you're not a member, in which case, what are you doing? Sort it out. Come on, join us. Right. Well, as always, it feels a bit silly to be leaving when there's 342 people watching, but what can we do? We've all got homes to go to. We're at home, you know what I mean? We've all got other things to do. That was brilliant. Really, really brilliant. And I loved it. Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, Emma. Just great talks. Really, really good. Everyone absolutely loved them. Thank you both. Thank you to all of you out there in sort of chat land or at home, wherever you are. It's lovely to see you all. Hopefully see you next week for the U webinar, and then the following week for the Fungi Symposium. But other than that, I think that's it. So thank you again, Emma. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.